Hi guys, it's Jo. I'm the Millennial Knitter and today I'm going to talk to you about the 10 weirdest words that I've learned in the first 6 months of my knitting journey. The first one I'm going to start with is one that probably sounds really basic to any of you that know anything about yarn or knitting, but that's yardage. So when I first started knitting I thought, well, patterns must tell you how many balls you need. How many of these guys? And they don't. They actually tell you how many yards you need, and you can see it on all of the ball bands. You see it under there. They tell you how many yards, and sometimes they give you in metric 140 meters. And what I didn't realize was why. And the reason why is that different amounts of balls, even if they're the same weight, can be different lengths. So yardage is how long the wool is. So if you pulled this whole ball out, you'd have a really big long piece of string, and the yardage tells you how long that piece of string would be. And when you're thinking about knitting a jumper or a dress or a scarf, they tend to give you the yardage because that can vary massively depending on how thick the wool is from band to band. So yeah, yardage was the first one that came as a bit of a surprise to me, and having cleared that up, I'll think about the next one. The next one we're going to talk about is skein. So similarly, what do you call this? I would call this a ball of wool. But apparently not. Apparently this is called a skein, S-K-E-I-N. I don't know why they're called skeins. It was mystifying to me at the beginning, but this is what they are. So when people talk about a skein of wool, they're not talking about something mysterious. They are literally talking about one of these guys. Sometimes they call them hanks as well. That I think means when they're the twisted long ones. I think that's a hank rather than a skein. I could be wrong. Better knitters, you can correct me in the comments. But yeah, those are what a skein is. That's why we call them skeins. Next one, notions. Notions, what's a notion apart from notions of grandeur? Which I definitely don't have about knitting yet. Notions is a fancy word for what I can gather is bits and bobs. So notions, when you see them in a pattern, are little bits and bobs that you might need in order to make the pattern. So one of the things you'll commonly see are these stitch markers. So you get little guys like this that help you keep your place when you're knitting. I've sometimes seen other things like a darning needle. You might need one of them. So notions is just other bits and bobs that you'll need to make your project apart from yarn and knitting needles. Those are your notions. Stash. What is stash? Stash is one of my favourite things. This is stash. Stash is, again, just a fancy word for all of the yarn that you've acquired, because you'll soon learn, as I have in my few months of knitting, that knitting and buying yarn are two separate hobbies that connect to one another, but they're not essentially the same hobby. So when you stockpile your yarn, like I have with some of this We Are Knitters lovely stuff, you will be building up stash, and I've got other stash in here that I need to think of something to knit with. And then you'll sometimes see the terms on Instagram or in podcasts of things like a stash buster project or a stash down, and what that refers to really is trying to use up the yarn you've already got in your stash, trying not to buy a ton of new yarn, as delicious as that is, but actually trying to work your way through some of the stuff that you've got. And you can sometimes build up stash because you buy an extra skein when you're making a project and you just don't use that. So sometimes you'll see projects which are advertised as kind of stash buster projects, and they're often like that because you can either use multiple thicknesses of wool or you can use multiple colours, so they'll help you use up your stash. K-A-L. What's K-A-L? You might see it hashtagged on Instagram, you might see it in podcasts. It stands for knit along. And what it tends to be is if you've been following somebody on Instagram or maybe a podcast, I follow this fantastic one called Make Good Pod. You will come together with the rest of the knitting community and you'll all be making either the same pattern, so maybe you'll all be making the same pattern hat or jumper or something, or you might all be using the same colour, or I've seen ones where it's just knit a hat, knit a sock, something. And the idea is that you all kind of work independently but together on the same type of project, and then you can share your progress with a hashtag or in real life when we get to do things in real life again. So that's K-A-L, knit along. Whip. You'll see that loads across lots of podcasts. Whips. Update on my whips. What are people talking about? So whips are, this might be really obvious to everybody else, wasn't that obvious to me, works in progress. So all that means is as soon as you've got something on your needles, like this cardigan that I've got, it's my work in progress. So it's one of my whips. I've got 3 at the moment. I've got this guy, which is a chunky cardigan that I'm working on. I've got a pair of socks. Well, it's not a pair, I've got 1 sock. It will eventually be a pair of socks. And I've got a bamboo cardigan that I'm working on as well. So if somebody asked me what my whips were, those would be then my works in progress. Weight, yarn weight. This was another one that's taken me a little while to figure out. But basically, when we're talking about weight of yarn, we tend to be talking about 2 separate things. So if you looked at these 2 balls of wool, they physically have a different weight to them. So this one is 100 grams. It's on the ball band. This one, I don't know, a little bit more, feels slightly heavier. If I weighed it, I could tell you exactly how much it weighs. But usually when we're talking about yarn weight, we don't actually, confusingly enough, mean physically how much the yarn weighs. What we actually are referring to usually is how thick it is. So you can see that this one is thicker than this one. I hope you can see that there. And when we're referring to yarn weight, we're often referring to the type of yarn. So this is a thinner weight yarn than this one. So you'll see terms like double knitting, 4-ply, Aran weight, worsted weight, chunky, all those kind of things. Those are ways of referring to the thickness of the yarn that confusingly is also called weight. Gauge. Gauge. What's gauge? Lots of patterns you'll see at the beginning will say knit to achieve a certain gauge, and what that's referring to is how many stitches per a specified size. So this chunky little cushion, you can see the stitches are really thick. If you were to take a little square here, you'd see there wouldn't be very many stitches in that square. Whereas if you took something like this dress, it's quite small gauge, you'd see that there are a ton of stitches in the same kind of size. And what tends to happen on patterns is the person writing the pattern will say, make sure that you get this gauge, and they'll say, you know, 10 stitches for 4 inches up and a certain number of rows down. So all gauge means is how many stitches across and how many rows down in a given space that the pattern designer tells you. And the reason that that matters is its size. So if you get the gauge wrong, your jumper's going to come out a funny size. Now I have to confess I have not yet actually attempted a gauge swatch. I've been just living on the edge, but that did result in a very small jumper that I had to make into a cardigan. And if you want to find out more about that and steeking, which is one of my other fancy words, stay tuned for another video. Steeking. What is steeking? Steeking is really, really fun, and I'm going to get my cardigan to show you what steeking is. So steeking, I think, basically means terrifyingly cutting your knitting, which seems like not the thing that you would want to do. But basically, I had to steek. I steeked this, what was the Cosy mock-necked jumper from Well Loved Knits, because I didn't do my gauge. I was a very naughty knitter and it was a bit small. So I decided to look at steeking and transform it into a much lovelier for me cardigan. And basically what I had to do that was reinforce 2 edges up the middle panel and then chop it. Terrifying, quite exhilarating. If you have a jumper that you want to be a cardigan, I suggest having a look at some steeking tutorials to figure out whether you can transform your knit into a cardigan. Definitely worth trying. And then my last one, Intarsia. So what is Intarsia? Intarsia, I'm not going to try and spell it, I'll write it on the screen, is one of the ways that you can do what we call colour work. So if you want to have colours in your knitwear, one of the techniques you can use is something called Intarsia. Now I tried this very early on, which may have been a little ambitious, there are a few mistakes, but with Intarsia you can end up with kind of panels or shapes that are all part of the knitting. So they're not embroidered on the top, they're all part of the same fabric. I don't know if you can see that on the inside, but basically you do it by swapping from one yarn to another, and instead of carrying the yarn across the back like you might do if you're making a Fair Isle jumper, you do a clever twisty thing. And I'll try and do a tutorial on this, or you can look up tutorials of much more experienced people than me. But basically Intarsia is super fun, and it creates these kind of gorgeous, any pattern you can think of you can create with Intarsia. I definitely recommend looking it up because I had a whale of a time doing this, even though it was a very basic starting point. So yeah, that's my 10 weird words for you. My first 6 months of the knitter. I'm sure there are lots more weird words out there, but those are the 10 that I started with, and I hope to see you in my next video.